So what was Jacob thinking as he walks towards Haran? Now, the Hebrew there for his walk is that he's lifting up his feet. And I've heard it even said that it sounds like Jacob is compared to coming to Bethel, he's almost skipping to Haran, Tra-la-la-la-la, I don't think he's skipping. I don't think Jacob is the kind of guy that skips, really. But we're told in Hosea chapter 12, verse 12, again, in Hosea chapter 12 is a chapter that speaks about Jacob. It says, "And Jacob fled into the country of Syria." Now, this word fled is a strong word. It means to make haste, or to flee, or to run away, or even to shoot, Jusinius suggests. So you get the idea. It's not the idea of one sort of casually strolling, picking up their feet. I think Jacob, on the way to Syria, I think he's brooding. Oh, I'll get to that in a moment. As he nears Haran, he sees an unusual sight. Now, what he sees is he sees sheep lying by a well, except the well's covered with a rock. And Jacob wonders what they're doing. And he draws nigh. He says in Genesis chapter 29, verse 7, "Lo, it's high day. Neither is it time that cattle should be gathered together. Water ye the sheep and feed them." Now, Jacob is incredulous. Now, apparently this man knows something about rearing and keeping sheep. And he would know that keeping sheep by a well, not watering them, where there's no grass, because, there'd be no grass by that well, because if you take sheep to a well every day and you make them sit there every day, in the country of Syria, guess what happens after a while? There's no grass left. That's right. So there'd be no grass, there'd be no water, they're just sitting there. Jacob could obviously see this was a bad idea, and that these were lazy shepherds. Now, what about Jacob's personality makes that so poignant? You see, Jacob's not a waiter. Jacob comes into a country he's never been before, and within moments has summarized the idea that these are bad shepherds. That quick. Who does that? Who shows up in a country they've never been before and immediately starts criticizing it? I do. No offense, right? But that's Jacob, isn't it? He's just got there. Obviously, they had a system. The system was that, until all the shepherds were gathered with their flocks, they wouldn't then roll off the stone, because somehow that was a matter of keeping peace. But to Jacob, that wasn't a system. That was bad shepherding. He wasn't interested in systems that made no sense. He had a system called act now and ask questions later. This is characteristic of Jacob. And the way I point this out is this is characteristic of Jacob. He was willing to be industrious. He was willing to work incredibly hard. And by all appearances, Jacob was a hard worker. Now, Laban wasn't a hard worker. That's what the record seems to suggest. And his sons certainly were hard workers. Years later, Jacob would say to Laban in Genesis 31, verse 40, "Thus I was in the day the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and sleep departed from my eyes." See, Jacob, he didn't mind hard work. What he minded was poor shepherding technique and mistreated animals. So he diagnoses the problem, and he determines to take action. He wasn't a waiter. He was a hard worker. Now, one might wonder what's going on with Laban's herds, by the way. I mean, his daughter is clearly the shepherd, but we're told in Genesis chapter 31 that Laban had sons. Are we not? And clearly this woman, Rachel, is attractive and she's young. And shepherding, as we just talked about with sleepless nights and frost and drought. Shepherding was dangerous work. What is a young girl with brothers doing on a job like this? But Jacob nevertheless sees Rachel. He rolls the stone away, which shows, if anything, it shows Jacob's not a wimp. He kisses her and he weeps. Now, do you get the sense that Jacob just might be carrying a bit of tension with him while he's on that journey? I mean, this is just, I suppose this is a bit of supposition, but he's thinking, as he's journeying, he's thinking, oh, what if my Uncle Laban has no daughters eligible to marry? Takes a step. Oh, suppose he has daughters, but I'm not attracted to any of them. Another step. Just suppose the families move cities. They're not actually in, Syria anymore. They've moved on. This is, every step he's taking is just one more moment for his mind to race over every single endless number of permutations of possibilities that he could be faced with. And so as he comes to the well and he sees Rachel, of course he weeps. Do you know how much tension he was carrying? Do you know how many questions he had in his mind? Can't you see him trying to figure it out? Trusting God. If you trust God, you might go tra-la-la, and just skip your way to Haran. Jacob, that wasn't his way. He's thinking about, is anyone else like this? You got a problem. There's a bit of uncertainty. You're not quite sure how it's going to work. So you think through every single possibility. But you know what the possibility that you spend the most time thinking about? That's right. The worst case possibility. That's the one because if you can work out that one, then everything else is just cake. That's what you do, isn't it? And so what happens when he shows up at that well and he realizes the worst case possibility has not manifested? He's weeping. But there's a problem. Although not apparent to Jacob at the time, you see, Rachel was actually not the woman that God had intended for the line of Christ. Did Jacob consider that question? I suppose that's a deep question, but I think Jacob had a lot of deep questions on his mind. Did he think about that one? See, Jacob was intensely interested in being in the line of the future Savior himself. So it's perhaps reasonable to consider who the woman would be that was in the line of the future Savior. What if God had intended for the Savior to come through another woman? But that's a problem, and that's a thought you can only work out with time. You can only work that out with time and consideration and prayer and care. But Jacob isn't a waiter. Within a month, Jacob had already decided the sister he intended to marry. He loved Rachel. Now, many a man have been so blinded by beauty that they're unable to see the quality of the woman they're attracted to. Now, there's a line of boys over here, and they're all doing something but not listening to me. Yeah, you guys, right there. Caleb, I hear you. Yeah, right? Micah, I see you, right? Many a man has been so blinded by the woman he's attracted to that they can't see the quality of that person. And I was that way before I met my wife. I had to throw that line in, right? Because this is going to go really badly if I said that wrong. When I look at the relationships I was in before Alyssa, several of those women have divorced their wives. Several of them have cheated on their husbands, and left the truth. It's actually shocking to look back at. That was me. That was me. So taken by certain physical things that put myself in a position to be unable to discern some spiritual things. So Jacob agrees to serve 7 years for Rachel. Now that appears to be extortion, except when you realize that Jacob actually suggests the price himself. I almost wonder if one of Laban's servants had come up to Jacob and said, hey, you might be able to marry her, but 7 years is the required service time. I'm not sure. I wonder, Rebekah had come with Abraham's servant for a few gifts. Here's some bracelets. Here's some jewelry. Maybe Bethuel and Laban thought that they had let Rebekah go cheaply. Or if I'm Jacob, I'm thinking, why don't I just go back to Isaac and ask him for a dowry? But that wasn't in the will of God. The will of God was that he was going to be there, and so he was going to be there for 7 years to serve for his wife. But just an observation, brothers and sisters, on the principle of negotiation. Anytime you negotiate with a man like Laban, and they accept your first offer, you bid too high. Right? Just saying. Right? Oops. We're told that Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, but they seemed to him but a few days for the love that he had for her. Now Jacob clearly loves Rachel dearly. And I've looked at Rachel, and I've heard and I've seen the analogies people build of Rachel, whose name means the ewe lamb, and who is the mother of Joseph. And they build these beautiful spiritual analogies, and they do that, and what they do is they make her out to be almost a Mary-like character. But I have trouble with Rachel, because these are my observations about Rachel that I can see. She comes across as childish and unreasonable, saying to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." She envied Leah. She appears to have made life bitter for Leah. She talks of prevailing over her sister. She bargains with Leah over Jacob's bed to get mandrakes. It was her idea to introduce Bilhah into the marriage. She steals her father's household gods. She lies to her father. She names her son so badly, Jacob feels compelled to change the name. And I don't blame a woman for what she says the last breath of her life, but Jacob doesn't accept her name of son of my sorrow as being the name of his last son. And she was not buried in the cave of Machpelah. Now these are the facts we know about Rachel's life. But Jacob was blind to Rachel in his affections, perhaps blind like his father had been, Isaac, in his affections for Esau. Jacob perhaps couldn't see that the older daughter, perhaps weak-eyed, perhaps even blind, who knows, but that was more dutiful and was perhaps the better wife. So on his wedding night, he's deceived. Now, it's probably no coincidence that Jacob is so ill-treated in Laban's house. Consider the parallels with his earlier dealings with Esau. I call this ironic hardship. Now, you can make a long list of these with Jacob. I'm just going to point out 3, but if you want to have some fun, you just try to find out all the ironic hardship in the life of Jacob. Jacob made Esau the victim of an unreasonable bargain when he couldn't negotiate. But Laban made Jacob an unreasonable bargain when he was in a position not to negotiate. Jacob took the firstborn birthright from Esau, but Jacob is deceived over the matter of Leah being the firstborn. Jacob deceived Esau to get the blessing that promised wealth and rulership, but Jacob is extorted by Laban to build Laban's own wealth whilst leaving Jacob impoverished. Now, interestingly, in this chapter concerning Jacob in Hosea chapter 12, we're told this: the Lord also hath a controversy with Judah, and will punish Jacob according to his ways. According to his doings will he recompense him. Now, let's just go through a thought experiment here. Now, just imagine for a moment that Jacob wakes up in the morning after his wedding, and he's surprised and he's hurt. But he doesn't take his instinctual reaction to go directly to Laban to complain. What if instead he waited, he prayed, he avoided making decisions, he considered Leah's plight? Consider for a moment, with the benefit of hindsight, the amount of bitterness and pain that was brought into his life by responding to the deception by requiring the marriage of Rachel as well. I think this brought strife for him. It brought strife for the 4 women who would share his bed. Could not God have brought Jacob's entire household from one woman? Could not Jacob have experienced happiness with Leah as a faithful wife? Could Jacob have seen this deception as a very clear sign that maybe he should leave the tents of Laban? Because maybe Laban's the kind of person that is going to take advantage of him. Is it simply a fait accompli that Jacob must have married Rachel? I ask that question not to criticize Jacob, but to ask myself the question, when I really want something, when I'm anticipating it, when I've already desired it, and it's taken from me, immediately my reaction is, what do I need to do to get back onto the course I was on when I was going to get what I wanted? Hardly ever does it occur to me at that point in time to wait. And we can see so clearly the implications of Jacob not waiting as we see his life in hindsight. So the question is, how do we respond when we are deceived, hurt, and taken advantage of? See, immediately, our uncontrollable reaction is what? We're just going to take matters into our own hands. But what if we had a different reaction? What if we started from a position of trust? Although I have been deceived, God has said that He is with me. But to do that, we have to see another truth. God can still be working for good even though other people have sinned. God can work with or despite the sins of others. Those sins are not a sign that God has forsaken us, so that having concluded that God has forsaken us, I can take the matter back into my own hands. What would it mean if I truly believed that God was with me even when I observe I have been sinned against? What would be different if I took that view of things? Would I find it easier to accept my circumstances? Would I seek God rather than blasting my problems with my own will? Would I learn to wait on God and ask Him to hear my cries? Would I seek first the kingdom while I waited? Would I learn that the trust and hopes set squarely on the accomplishments and ambitions of this world are eventually and inevitably misplaced trust and hopes? Would I learn to wait patiently on God? Would I learn the value of setting my hope on Him? Would I find courage to face fear? Would I find strength to bear the weak? Tell me, what would the outcome be, actually, if I believed that in the face of being sinned against, that God is still with me, that His will isn't compromised, that His love has not separated from me? But how does someone like Jacob learn to trust? How does someone like me, how do I learn to trust? You see, brothers and sisters, I'm willing to trust God, but there is a secret condition. The condition, unspoken, but very clear, is, God, I'm willing to trust you if you fulfill for me most, if not all, of my heart's most willful desires. If you do, especially the ones that I fear are out of my reach, I'm happy to trust. But if it looks like it's not going to work, then I'm taking back control. Deal? That sounds a lot like Jacob, doesn't it? If the basis of trusting God is that our will is done, that trust has a faulty foundation and will fail. The basis of trust can never be the accomplishment of our will. The only basis for trust has to be the willingness to accept God's will. It really helped me to write that sentence. You know that? It really helped me to write that sentence. I sit there and I'm just pondering this, brothers and sisters. Just pondering it. I'm thinking, yes, when I pray to God and I trust Him, what I'm really trusting Him to do is to navigate a way for me to get what I want, because I can't see how to navigate it myself. And if God happens to navigate that way, then hallelujah, praise God. I trust God because I couldn't figure out how to do it, and He got me what I wanted anyway. And I've always wanted that to be the basis of trusting God, really. Really, if I peeled back the spiritual layers and overtones, that's what I kind of really wanted. To trust God on the basis of accepting His will and recognizing that is the only basis from which trust can operate. I can't say, God, I trust you, my will be done. That will never work. that is going to fail. And if that is my basis of trust, I will be disappointed. I can trust that God knows my heart's desires. But I have to trust that God knows better. See, Jacob's trouble with trust, which is why God appears to him again in chapter 31 in verse 3, and God says, "And the Lord said unto Jacob, Return unto thy land, the land of thy fathers, and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee." Now Jacob needed to hear this. That's why God says it. And this is God talking to Jacob, I think 40 years, some say 20 years, after he had first appeared to him at Bethel. We don't have any record of God having communed with Jacob in that time period. I think about 20 years ago, and I was living in Israel 20 years ago. Right. And imagine from that time till now, that's a lot of time. And so Jacob needs to hear this message, that I will be with thee. And I think Jacob resonates with that message because he says in his prayer, God, if you're going to be with me, and keep me in the way that I'll go. But Jacob also says in Genesis chapter 32, verse 9, this interesting thing. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, the God of my father Isaac, the Lord which said unto me, Return to thy country, referring to Genesis 31, verse 3, and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. So Genesis 32, verse 9 is clearly a reference back to Genesis chapter 31, verse 3. But Jacob, now it's funny, there's a famous case in the United States of a baseball player who took steroids. And he went in front of Congress and he lied about whether he took steroids. And finally the evidence was made compellingly that he had. And they asked him, said, how could you have lied before Congress? He says, I didn't lie. I just misremembered. I think he's a Donald Trump supporter. Now, what happened here is that Jacob remembers what God says, but he changes it ever so subtly, doesn't he? Because God didn't say, I will deal well with thee. God had said, I will be with thee. But the point being that Jacob has to interpret a life where God has given him the assurance that he is with Jacob, and simultaneously where Jacob can perceive that he is both deceived and afraid and ashamed. And he has to navigate that reality. In the matter of Rachel, Jacob did what any of us would have done. I've been deceived, and now I'm going to put the matter straight. And Laban negotiates 7 more years of labor for his second daughter, and Jacob agrees. Now, you could have argued that Jacob could have negotiated better terms. It seems like extortion. Where the reality is actually that God would use this time of building the wealth of Laban in order to transfer that wealth to Jacob. Genesis chapter 30, verse 25 reads this. And it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said unto Laban, Send me away that I may go unto my own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served thee, and let me go. For thou knowest my service which I have done thee. And Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry, for I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. Now Laban had become very wealthy in animals because of Jacob. Now how do you think Jacob would have felt? Working hard every day in the heat, in the cold, losing sleep, fighting with beasts, knowing that the result of your labor is that you've made your deceiver more and more wealthy as a result of those labors. Yet God was going to transfer much of that wealth, perhaps all the strongest of Laban's flocks, to Jacob. But this is something Jacob could only find out by being forced to wait. So Laban came to terms with Jacob. Jacob said that he would take the speckled, the spotted amongst the goats, and the brown or black amongst the sheep. Now, the reason Jacob does this is that those animals could be clearly identified as his. He would not be accused of taking Laban's animals because it would be obvious, because of the markings on the animals, which animals clearly belonged to him and which animals had belonged to Laban. But then Laban acts very deceitfully with Jacob, and it doesn't really come across very clearly in the King James Version. So read this with me out of the RSV. Laban said, "Good, let it be as thou hast said." But that day Laban removed the he-goats that were striped and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in charge of his sons. And he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. And Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flock. Now, I have to admit, reading the King James my whole life, it wasn't obvious to me that this is what Laban did. See, Laban and Jacob agree that Jacob's wages is going to be the cattle and goats that are born speckled and spotted. So what Laban does, he agrees to terms with Jacob, shakes the hand. Yep, those are going to be the terms. Fine. And while Jacob is away, Laban goes through his flocks and takes out every speckled and spotted among the goats and black amongst the sheep, and he moves them 3 days away from Jacob. So Jacob comes out on day 1 of his hire with Laban and sees a flock that has no speckled, that has no spotted, that has no ring streaked, that has no black and brown amongst the sheep. He sees a uniform flock that has no natural means of reproducing and producing the breeding stock that he can then take away and be paid with. That was day 1 of working for Laban. Now, you may think of Jacob as being a mean man, someone that's willing to work and twist to get his own way, someone that has been driven to achieve his own ends. But Jacob more than met his match with Laban. So Laban's objective is 100% to use Jacob to leave him with nothing, to impoverish his own daughters in the process. This is what Laban is trying to do. Did you ever have an employer that you didn't like? Did you ever have issues with your in-laws? Now, Chris and Catherine are nothing like Laban. Just saying. Right? Nothing. Yesterday, they bought me ice cream. They're very nice people. This is unbelievable, isn't it? So Laban was only too happy to accept the deal, and then he twisted the terms. That's Laban. I think it's worth chronicling for a moment how painful it is to work and live with a man like Laban. I have a bunch of these. They're so exhaustive, I don't know that I'm going to get through them all for fear of boring you. But look at like what men like Laban and his sons are really like. They confuse the facts. See, they consider honest wages as stealing. The sons of Laban were saying, Jacob has taken all that was our father's. Jacob didn't take anything. Jacob earned as a wage. They are given to exaggeration to prove a point. The sons of Laban were saying Jacob has taken all that was our father's. That's not true. Jacob didn't take all that was Laban's. They intend to extort the ones that make them wealthy. Genesis 30, verse 42. If God had not been on my side, surely you would have sent me away empty-handed. That was the intention, was to send Jacob away empty-handed. They go back on their word. Yet your father has cheated me and changed my wage 10 times. They treat their daughters like slaves. His daughters even say, are we not regarded by him as foreigners? They impoverish their daughters by spending up their inheritance. Now, part of the reason that you took a dowry is for two reasons. One, to compensate the loss of the daughter, and secondly, to build up a gift that you can then give your family to get them started. But in Laban's case, what he did is he spent up everything that Jacob had given him by the wages. For Genesis 31 verse 15 says, for he sold us, and he has been using all the money given for us. They hypocritically accuse others of doing the things they do. Laban says, you have cheated me. Laban has said to Jacob, you've cheated me and carried away my daughters like captives of the sword. They exaggerate their generosity. Laban says, I might have sent you away with mirth and songs and tambourine and lyre, and with no money whatsoever. They admit no fault and put all the blame on others. Genesis 31 verse 28, now you have done foolishly, says Laban. They assume the motives of others falsely. Genesis 31 verse 30, and now you have gone away because you long greatly for your father's house. They deal harshly with their workers. Genesis 31 verse 39, that which was born by wild beasts, Jacob says, I did not bring it to you. I bore the loss of it myself. Of my hand you required it, whether stolen by day, or by night. They're so self-absorbed, they think of all things as their own when they belong to others. The daughters are my daughters. The children are my children. The flocks are my flocks. All that you see is mine. Now that's worth underlining, because that is the verse, I think, that really describes Laban, how he thought, how he processed information. That all these things were his. He processed every bit of information this way. What happens is he receives facts and information, and he processes it through the filter. And the filter he processes it through is this good for me, or is this not good for me? And then based on that, he says, I like it or I don't. That's how Laban processes information. Everything through the lens of self. Ironically, his name means white. I think because in his own eyes, he was always innocent. And all the time, he thought he was winning. He thought he was increased with goods. He was really losing. He lost the family. He lost his wealth. He lost respect. And perhaps most importantly, he lost opportunity for the kingdom, which Jacob gave to Leah and to Rachel, and to Bilhah, and to Zilpah. And Jacob could have given to him as well. So why does the Bible paint such an obvious and one-sided picture of Laban? Is it not to help us see overwhelmingly that Jacob had learned the lessons of deception and scheming? Is it so Jacob can see so clearly that God is with him? Because he was in an environment where he was forced to wait. And being forced into a position of inaction, when he was totally outmaneuvered, and we could not really change his circumstances other than to continue to work hard every day, that only then he could see the miracle that God did. You see, Jacob is convinced by all this that God is with him. And that was the point of this hardship. Consider in Genesis chapter 31 and verse 5. If you're there, turn over to the page. Genesis chapter 31 and verse 5. When Jacob calls his wives to see him, I want you to see the emphasis upon God here. I see that your father does not regard me with favor, Jacob says, as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I've served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not permit him to harm me. If he said, the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. If he said, the striped shall be your wages, all the flock bore striped. Thus God has taken away the cattle of your father and given him to me. Do you see the point? Jacob was only able to see that God was with him because he was in an impossible situation that he couldn't fix or make better. It was obvious that God had done it because he couldn't do it. By contrast, do you think that Jacob felt that God was with him when he deceived Esau? In truth, God was with him. But because his own will accomplished it, because he desired it and he took it, do you think he could perceive then that God was with him? It's very hard to see that God is with you until you're put into a position where you have to wait. So in the previous chapter, Jacob had devised a very strange scheme. He thought that if the animals conceived before rods, where the bark was peeled back to show the white underlayer, that it influenced the coats of the baby animals when they were born. But even though it was God, at the time Jacob didn't know it. And until the dream he had where he saw the angels clearly directing and controlling the birth results, he probably felt that his own actions were the cause of his unbelievably good results. You know, how often can it be that we think it's our great ideas, our organization, our charisma, our know-how that are achieving the wonderful results when our ideas are nothing more than pilled rods? And it's God who's really doing something. It's God who's accomplishing everything. But you know what's instinctual, for me at least, brothers and sisters? What's instinctual is I want to take full credit for the successes, and I'd like to blame God for the problems. That's me. I think the miraculous breeding program was my idea. We'll have cattle on rods when they mate. Brilliant. In reality, it was God the whole time. But this is what is important. Jacob worked diligently. and faithfully and to the best of his ability every day, despite awful treatment. Jacob couldn't control it, but day by day he did his part, because faith without works is dead. If Jacob, despite being treated awfully, and despite being given horrible circumstances to work in, if he hadn't been faithful and diligent and worked hard every day in order to have the greatest success he possibly could with the breeding animals, then God probably wouldn't have worked the work that he did. So waiting for God is a combination of trusting in him and doing your very best every day, but recognizing that the success of it is really from God alone. And so in the dream, the angel says something even more interesting. He says in Genesis chapter 31, verse 13, I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointest the pillar, and where thou vowest a vow unto me. Now arise and get thee from this land, and return unto thy kindred. Now imagine you haven't heard from God directly for 40 years. The last time you heard from God, you made a vow. And when you made that vow, you were hungry, you were cold, and you were scared. You asked God, if you'll just give me bread to eat, if you just give me clothing to wear, if you just bring me back safely to my father's house, then you'll be my God. So the angel now mentions that vow here. You think he's offering Jacob a little perspective? Remember the vow, Jacob, the angel seems to be saying. The angel brings up the vow. The angel's saying, Jacob, I'd like you to remember that vow that you made. We're told in Genesis 30, verse 43, that Jacob has increased exceedingly. So much so that the sons of Laban claim that he has taken away all that was our father's. So it seems to be that God has overwhelmingly fulfilled Jacob's request. In the midst of trial, even when he had gone 14 years without a single animal to his name. And the question seems to be from the angel, can you trust God now? Remember your vow? You had nothing. You just asked for a bit of food and for some clothing. Can you trust God now? The angel tells him to leave, but the angel doesn't tell him that he needs to steal away without telling Laban. The angel didn't say that. That was Jacob's idea. That's the problem with God. He doesn't supply us with enough details, actually. God just says, go. And Jacob says, well, what I'll do is I'll sneak away while Laban is shearing sheep. So there's some obvious flaws with this plan. Firstly, Laban is sure to find out because his household is large, and his servants are not going to keep a secret from their master. And if Jacob isn't watching the flock, someone else is bound to be watching the flock and is bound to ask questions. The second obvious flaw is if Jacob is taking vast amounts of animals with him, he'll only be able to travel slowly, which is what he told Esau a little bit while. Esau says, come with me to Seir. And Jacob says, no, I have to go slowly because I have these animals. If Jacob has to travel slowly, then surely Laban is going to be able to catch up. So a confrontation is delayable, but it's not avoidable. So why does Jacob steal away suddenly and without notice? Well, we're told that he does that because he's afraid. In Genesis 31, verse 31, Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid. For I said, peradventure thou wouldst take by force thy daughters from me. So here's the irony of Jacob's circumstances. He sees clearly that God is with him. Yet he has ample evidence to conclude that God being with him does not make him immune to pain and conflict. So whilst God is with him, he still fears the day-to-day reality. This is what we see Jacob do later on with Esau. He truly believes that God is with him, yet he's terrified to meet Esau. Here Jacob can see that God is with him, but he's frightened of what Laban is capable of doing and enforcing. Should he be afraid of Laban? Well, isn't it reasonable that Laban, the man that he was, will not act well and will hurt Jacob or try to steal back what Jacob's rightfully earned? And even take his daughters by force, which is what Jacob is afraid of. Jacob knew Laban better than we do. Isn't it reasonable to exercise caution? Where is caution prudent and blind faith foolhardy? That's the question I see here. That's the question I'm wrestling with. When is caution prudent and blind faith foolhardy? But what if caution is a cause for sin? Well, that's a topic we're going to have to cover in our next class. So just to conclude, what are the principles of surrender here that we learn from this story in the life of Jacob? Jacob was not a man naturally inclined to wait. Are we? God uses hardship to teach us the consequences of our sin towards others. Just because things are desperately unfair doesn't mean God has stopped working. At that moment, he could be working the most. We must continue to labor our best, even under trying conditions, which is a witness to others, like Laban, that God is with us. When we see that the benefits God has wrought, we must fight the idea that our pilled rods have achieved the results. Even when we have proof that God is with us, fear doesn't disappear. So now Jacob is going to have to face the greatest fear of his life. Even though he knows God is with him, even though he has now just confessed 3 times, God is with me. I was not in control. I could not help my circumstances. God clearly transferred the wealth of your father and has given to me. God did that, Jacob says. God did it. And I'm completely terrified that Esau is about to destroy me. We'll take up that subject in our next study.